Okay, guys, I'll go ahead and get started. Of course, when I practiced this at home, I didn't have a microphone and all that kind of fun stuff, so we'll see how this goes. But the title, as you can see, is How Open Source Can Help Your Project. Also, I'll be talking about that, and I'll also be talking about some steps that you can take to make an open source project more successful. So, my name is Yonker. Most people know me as Destroy. Here's some contact information. If you want a copy of the slides, you can grab that URL there. If you want, also xda-TV is here recording the session, so if you miss something or want to see it again, you can go and find that again later on. A little bit about me. I have over 3 years working on Android custom recovery, specifically the Teaming Recovery Project, or as I usually call it, TWRP. I know some people also call it TWRP. Been the lead developer of that for a little over 3 years. Wasn't the lead developer at the very beginning. I can't say for sure, but I believe I was the first person to get native Bluetooth tethering to work on MediaTek devices. I was given a smartwatch that was basically just a MediaTek phone stuffed into a watch, and the owners of that device really wanted to be able to tether the device to their cell phone via Bluetooth. But the stock ROM that MediaTek provided, at least with 4.2, did not support that natively. And so I had a copy of their ROM source code, and I was able to modify the settings, APK, Bluetooth, and frameworks to make all that work. I'm a senior recognized developer on XDA. I'm a Kansas City native, and my day job actually has nothing to do with Android, so I really just do the Android thing as a kind of a hobby. So consider myself a little bit of a purist in that sense. Before I get started, I'll talk a little bit about what some of the downsides to using open source might be. The first one is pretty obvious. If your source code is out there for anybody to download and compile for themselves, it can cut you off from some easy or obvious revenue streams. It makes it much more difficult for you to actually sell the product directly. That doesn't mean that there aren't ways to make money off of open source, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Another thing, of course, is that since your code is out there for anybody to view, your code is open to criticisms, and any mistakes that you make in that code are going to be fairly visible. Another thing that's worth pointing out is that others can steal your work. I like to put that in quotes because honestly the point of open source is that your work is out there for anybody to grab if they want to, assuming that they stay within your license requirements. So, based on those, why would you choose open source? Well, there's some good reasons for that. First of all, you can sometimes get some free support for your product. As your users get more involved, they're more likely to help other new users if your product is open source. You may also eventually, potentially, get some free development. Over time, your project may attract other developers, and those developers may contribute valuable bug fixes or new features. With the Team Recovery project, we've seen this. There's a couple of guys that have contributed some very nice things. We've got Tassadar that maintains the multi-ROM fork of TWRP, and he recently submitted the TrueType font patch that'll be in our next release. He also was able to jump in when 4.3 was released and get our libtar backup system updated so that it could read and write the SE-Linux context for backup and restore. So those are some ways that we've seen other developers jump in. We also have another guy with a screen name of _that that's helped us out with legacy system properties, and he recently helped revamp some of our MTP code to fix some of the bugs and make it a little bit cleaner. Open source is generally seen as good. You'll get a lot of goodwill just because of the fact that it's open versus closed. There's a lot of, I don't want to say negative connotation with closed, but openness generally gets a lot of positive that gets attached with that. Another thing that you get with open source is visibility. Open source projects tend to attract the attention of other developers and users and helps get them involved and so forth. And so part of that also goes along the line with that goodwill. An open source project, it seems to garner more attention because people like it. You'll also get some increased trust with an open source project because other developers can inspect your code and they can verify that you're not doing something nefarious. Open source may help you with the race to the bottom. We've seen that discussed here and there, partly because things like the Google Play Store, a lot of times there's a sort of a competition to get the best app out there for the cheapest price so that you can gain the largest mind share. And being open source and being free can help you with that a little bit in the sense that it may be easier for you to do your project cheaper. And being open, again, since it's attracting more attention, may also allow you to supplant an existing product that may be more closed source than you are. Another thing that comes along with being open source is that it ensures your project can have a life beyond just you. Now, far be it for me to suggest that maybe you're going to die, getting hit by a bus or something like that, but maybe more likely over time you'll just get tired of working on it, and so somebody else may pick up the product after you're done with it and give it another push. Being open source can also maybe give you a little bit of fame and fortune. I don't expect that you're going to be a huge celebrity like a Kardashian or something like that, but at least among some smaller circles, you may gain a little bit of e-fame, if you will. Also, being open source means that an employer can see the work that you're doing, they can review your code, and they may reach out to you and say, hey, we think you'd be a good fit for our company, we really like what you're doing, and maybe you'd like to get paid doing it. Another thing that you get with being open source is, especially with the recovery side of things that I use, you can get a broader base of testing. It's impossible for me to buy all the different devices that we try to support. And by being open source, it makes it easier for other developers and users to test our code and make sure that it works on their devices. Sometimes we push patch sets, merge them into our source code. We haven't released it in a full public release. And some of the guys I work with will download those patches and compile them for their own devices just because they want to have the latest and greatest before everybody else does, and they'll give you some feedback and say, hey, this isn't working quite right on my device, and so we'll be able to fix those before we release them to the wild. Another thing is, if your product is free, you don't have to process any refunds. You also, I hate to use the term to say lower expectations, but it's somewhat true that with an open source project where people aren't paying you a bunch of money to use your product, they have a little bit, they're a little bit more accepting of your bugs and your minor mistakes. Another thing that comes along with being open source too is that you can create new relationships with other like-minded people. I know that over the last 3 years I've made a lot of relationships with some of the people in this room and a lot of the people that are here at the Big Android Barbecue, and that's been a really great thing for me, and I really like that networking that I get with working on an open source product. So you've decided, hey, I like all these pluses that I'm going to get with being open source, so how can I make my open source project successful? First thing I can say is start with the idea of something that people want. If you're working on something that only you actually want, chances are nobody else is really going to care. Make sure that what you're doing isn't something that somebody else has already done. So do a little research, and if you are working on something that somebody's already done, make sure that you're doing something that's significantly better than what already exists. Be committed to your project for the long haul. It takes a long time for a community to spring up around your project. So you're going to have to think, it's not like you're going to be able to work on it for a couple weeks and throw it out there, and then everybody else is going to be like, oh, yay, that's fantastic. I want to jump in and help you and make it awesome. It's probably going to take you more than a year before you even start becoming successful. I know in some of my research for this topic, I found that a lot of open source projects petered out in less than 8 months. And so if you're not committed to it and get that mindset up front that you're going to be doing this for a long time, it's probably never going to happen for you. You'll need to be very patient. You need to make yourself available. Make it clear what the best way to contact you is. I know for me, I get a lot of different ways that people try to contact me, and so I try to make it as clear as possible that the best way to get hold of me is to come to our IRC channel and contact me directly there. You'll need to have a clear bug reporting system. Just like the contact methods, I get people that are trying to report bugs in every which way. I get people through IRC, people posting on forums, sending emails. We usually try to steer people towards our GitHub issue log because we can then have a very clear list and people can hopefully search it so they're not duplicating their bug reports. You should also try to answer questions as quickly as you can, if that's possible. It helps make you connected with your users if you're answering their questions quicker, and it makes them give you more goodwill towards your product if they know that you're invested in it too. Creating documentation, I gotta be honest, a lot of developers really hate creating documentation, and it's not exactly my strong suit either, but if you can create some documentation for your open source product, it makes it easier for your users to understand your product. You should also look at your documentation from the developer side too, so that if somebody wants to jump in and contribute to your product, they'll know what the layout is and where things can be found in how to use your product, how to compile it, those kinds of things. So to be cognizant of what kind of documentation you should create for your project so that you can make it easier for other people to help you out. Over time, you're going to want to try to build a community. That's going to be the best way for your product to gain the support that you really need. And the ways that you can do that, is if you're the leader of your product or your project, you're going to need to be very careful about how you treat other people. You set the tone for your project as the leader, and if you're setting the wrong kind of tone, you're going to attract the wrong kind of people. The right kind of people may come in, and if they talk to you and you're a total jerk to them, they're going to be like, no, I don't want to help out with this, I don't want to be a part of this. And you're going to end up attracting the wrong kind of people instead, and they're going to be treating your users the same way that you do. So be sure that you're being respectful of other people, even if you can't help them out, just say, hey, I don't have time, or I don't want to right now, but point them to the documentation that you've hopefully created so that they can try to help themselves. And be as helpful as you can when you can. For your open source project, hopefully you're writing better code. Since your code is going out there where everybody can view it and see what you've done and see the mistakes that you've made, hopefully you're making very good decisions about the code that you're actually merging into your project. If you use modular programming techniques and object-oriented code, especially if your project is a really large one, it makes it easier for other people to work with your code when they can say, I just need to work with this little capsule, this piece, this object within the project, instead of having to try and sift through the entire project. The object-oriented code will help them so that if they make one modification somewhere, they're not having to test it and they're not breaking 16 other things in the project by making that change. Use good variable names that are easy to understand. That helps with the self-documentation of the code, and comment your code so that it is documented, and so that when a developer looks at your code, they don't look at it and have to spend hours just trying to figure out where they need to be in that code. You'll also, if you're expecting other people to actually submit code to your project, you want to document your code style. So if you want 2 spaces or 4 spaces or tabs, if you want to cut to 80 character width, those kinds of things, you want to try and document that for them. And document your submission guidelines. If there's an agreement that they need to agree to when they're submitting, if they're supposed to submit it through a Garrett instance, or if you want it to come with a merge request on GitHub, try to document those things so that it's easy for somebody to see, this is how I'm supposed to submit code, this is the style that they want it in, so that you get a much better relationship with your developers that way. And try not to code yourself into a corner. This one's kind of hard to really discuss, but when you're designing your application or your project, try to make sure that you make it extensible so that you're not stuck and then having to do some kind of huge rebase and huge reworking of your code. Then that'll turn people off when that happens, especially if they're forking your project. Try to utilize some basic marketing techniques. And I know this is a little hard for some developers because they're basement dwellers and they don't want to get out there and actually talk to people. But if you can get out there on social media like Google Plus or Twitter, I usually try. We have a Team Win Recovery Project community on Google Plus that people can join and be a part of and help each other out. So try to use social media to your advantage. You'll get a lot of people in your circles or following you. And make friends at various news sites. I know I try to reach out to some of the editors or writers at some of the news sites so that when we're doing a new release, we can say, give them a heads up a couple of days in advance, give them a list of our features and say, hey, hopefully you can get an article ready to go so that when we push it out, you can flip the little switch so that the article shows up on your site at the same time. A lot of those writers will be very happy to work with you because they're getting paid to write, and so if you can develop that relationship, that'll help you a lot. And that helps with the next item here, the making your new releases very visible. If you can get your release, if you're putting a new release out there, let people know through your social media and talk to your editors and let them know that you're putting that out there so that everybody can see that the new release is out there. You also want to continue innovating your project. You try to do a little bit of an iterative development cycle so that you're putting something out there fairly frequently. That helps keep your project fresh in the mind of your users and the other developers. You want to be thinking about what new features you're going to want to implement well before you actually start coding them. A lot of the features that we implement in our project, I've been thinking about in the back of my head for months or sometimes even years. One of the items that I've been thinking about trying to implement for a long time now is within the recovery we have a zip queue feature where you can choose to install 2 or 3 or 4 zips all at once. And I'd like to be able to implement that feature throughout the whole system so that you could queue a backup and a wipe and then a zip install and reboot after it's all done. But I still can't figure out how I want to do that from a user interface perspective and present it to the end user in a way that makes sense, especially when you're dealing with new people that have no idea what they're doing. Because if it's too complicated, then I'll be getting way more support emails and it'll just be a huge mess. So try to be thinking about what your new features are going to be and figure out what the best way to implement those within your project is. If you stop moving the project forward, somebody else may think you're done with it. And so they may take it and take the ball and start running with it, and you may end up losing control of your project. So if you want to maintain control of that project, you need to stay out in front and continue innovating so that people know that you're still invested in it. You'll also probably want to come up with some guiding principles for your project. This is what I used when I first decided I wanted to take over leading the project. I went through in my head the things that I wanted to do with the project just at a very high level. One of those was that we wanted to be open source. That was a big decision for us right at the beginning, that we wanted to put everything out there. We weren't going to hold any special features back for a special private pro version or something like that. We wanted everything to be out there for developers to be able to see and use. We also wanted to offer our product free of charge, so we weren't going to charge for anything. We weren't going to charge for installing it, any of those kinds of things. We wanted to provide good documentation so that we could get other people involved in it. We also said that we were going to work with any app. So while we might recommend a specific app and say, hey, this is the app that we recommend because we've worked with this developer and we've vetted the app and we know that it's a good quality app that's going to work, we're still open to working with other app developers and allowing them to work with our product. One of the features that we have in the TeamWin recovery is something that we call the open recovery script, which is a way for apps to write to a file that the recovery will pick up when it boots up and do various things like perform backups or wipes or restores. And we said we weren't going to try and lock that down to any one specific app so that we actually provide documentation for that open recovery script so that any app developer could come along and see that documentation, read it, start working with it. And we've seen some pretty interesting implementations in apps. I know there's been some documentation on how you can use Tasker to schedule an automatic backup every night or every week, whatever it is that you wanted to do. And so it's been pretty cool to see how being open and working with any app like that has been used by other users and developers. Another thing that we put in is that we try not to accept any device-specific code because that creates a mess in our code base. And so that was one of the decisions that we made early on with our project as well. When you go into an open source project, expect that your code is going to be canned. It's just going to happen. That's the nature of open source. That's the point of open source, is that you're going to get canned. Hopefully the person that canned you will give you credit for the work that you did, but don't be upset about it because that's why you did it in the first place. And if somebody else comes along, that's actually a huge piece of flattery that you should take that as flattery, because they're looking at your code and saying, man, this is good code. I don't want to write it. I couldn't write it any better than this, so I'm going to take this and I'm just going to use that. I couldn't do any better. If you're doing things right, other projects may start using your code. They may contribute their code back. And we've seen that with the multi-ROM fork of Twerp, that the developer of that Tacitor has contributed several good features back to our product because he wants us to have the same great things that he's developed. If you're working on an open source product, and this goes even with a closed source product too, you want to use your time wisely. Don't get bogged down too much trying to do support. Hopefully by the point where you're spending a lot of time on it, you've developed this community around it that can help back you up and support you in various ways. And so you can read your forum posts on the forum and say, no, I don't need to answer that because somebody else in 5 minutes is probably going to come and answer it for me. Also, try to avoid burning yourself out. If you're spending too much time on it, try to strike some balance so that you don't burn out. If you spend a ton of time trying to push a new release out there, give it a few days after the release to make sure you didn't push out any huge bugs, and then take a little bit of a break for a week or two. When you're working on an open source project too, you're going to want to choose a license. So I'm going to try and touch a few of the bigger licenses that you see out there. And I don't claim to be a license expert. I'm definitely not a lawyer. So you'll want to verify anything that I put up there. And if I put something up here that's wrong, feel free to correct me. But I figured I'd touch base on some of these at least. You could probably do a whole session or maybe even a few sessions about all the differences and nuances of these licenses, but we'll give it a stab here. First of all, you've got the GPL. The GPL is copyleft. That means that if you take the code, if you put GPL license on something, anything that you add and any code that you've used before ends up needing to be able to be licensed under the GPL, or at least compatible with the GPL. It's somewhat viral in that nature. With the GPL, if you distribute some code that uses the GPL license or has a GPL license on it, you're required to provide source when requested. So be prepared that anything that you write or use under the GPL that you're going to have to release your source code with that. Most of these licenses require some kind of copyright notice, which is true of the GPL. Also, most of these licenses, no warranty or support is required of you. So that'll be part of your license there. There is some differences between version 2 and version 3 that are worth pointing out. Version 3 addressed compatibility with other licenses. So like GPL v2 is not compatible with Apache 2.0, but GPL v3 is. There were also some additions to the version 3 that deal with patents. The language in version 3 is more international friendly. In version 2, they used a lot of US specific copyright type language, and so with version 3 they tried to correct that with more international friendly language. And lastly, they added some pieces to make it more DRM friendly. It's also worth noting that the GPL is fairly restrictive, and there's a lot of companies that will refuse to use code that's GPL just because of some of the restrictions that are involved with dealing with GPL source code. The LGPL is fairly similar to the GPL, except that it's usually used for libraries, and it allows you to write a non-GPL program that links to that library and uses that library without requiring that program that you wrote be GPL as well. So be cognizant of that. If you made changes to the GPL library, the LGPL library, you would need to be able to provide source for that, but you would not have to provide source for your program that you wrote that uses that library. The Apache license tends to emphasize more developer freedom. There's a lot fewer restrictions. You're not required to release your source code changes. It's also much more widely accepted in the business and enterprise world. So if you're wanting to develop something that other companies might use, or you want other companies to embrace it, you may want to consider using the Apache license instead of the GPL. MIT is GPL compatible. You're free to do nearly anything you want with the source code. Again, there's the whole copyright notice and no warranty or support is required. The BSD is a little bit different in the sense that you cannot use the original source project name in your distribution unless you've got direct permission. So what this means is that if I use the BSD license on the Team Win Recovery, if you wanted to release something that was based on my code, you couldn't call it the Team Win Recovery project unless you received permission directly from me to do so. Again, you have the copyright notice, and again, no warranty or support is required. The public domain, there sort of is a license for this, but you gotta be careful with it because some people actually don't even consider it a license, but generally speaking, you're free to use it. Anyone's free to use it for any purpose. The author usually tries to give up or disclaim their copyright to the code, but some countries, the laws for copyrights don't allow an author to actually give up all of their rights, and so you have to be somewhat careful when you're dealing with something that's licensed in the public domain. Before I actually get into the questions, I'll just try to iterate a little bit of some of my experiences dealing with open source and being part of an open source project. With the Team Win Recovery, when I went into it as the lead developer, I knew that it was going to take a while. As I said earlier, I went into it with the idea that it was going to be at least a year, maybe even 18 months before it started taking off. It ended up not taking quite that long because the community seemed to embrace it a lot more than I expected, and also partly because what I consider my competitors, I don't really like to think of them as competitors like that in the sense like I'm going to squash them with my boot or something, but you know, the other people that develop similar projects just didn't really innovate that much while we were innovating. We were expecting people to kind of jump in and, you know, start innovating there and kind of give us some, you know, competition in that sense, you know, the first to develop this or the first to develop that. And so it really exploded a lot faster than we thought it would. And there was a point where I realized to myself, this is probably bigger than I think it is, because a lot of time I was just kind of heads down, writing my code and doing my thing, and not really paying attention to how much people were enjoying using the project. So, but that may not happen with yours. Some of my research regarding this topic indicated that people expect with an open source project that it's going to be, that the community is just going to spring up around it because it's open source. But it really isn't the community in the sense that there's one big, huge open source community out there that embraces all these open source projects. Instead, each project kind of has its own separate little community, and that's what we've seen with the team wind recovery. So don't expect that some community is going to come behind you and just carry your project off into the sunset and it's going to be a perfect happy ending. You're going to have to kind of develop your own little community around your project. So anyway, I do appreciate all of you coming to my session. I thank you very much for your attendance. If you have questions, they don't have to be related to open source or open source projects. If you have questions about the team wind recovery or anything else, feel free to ask at this point.
You didn't mention a lot about Creative Commons. Creative Commons.
What?
It's not a source code license. The Creative Commons actually says specifically do not use with source code.
Right.
It's for documentation and artwork and other resources that wouldn't be covered by a traditional source code license. It's basically a license that's similar to the GPL or Apache license. You kind of pick your different flavor and apply it.
Yeah.
The question was, why didn't I talk about the Creative Commons license, and maybe if I could speak to that, and I'll let Mike here real quick.
As I was saying, it's a license for everything but your source code, and it can work like the GPL or the Apache or the MIT. There's various forms of Creative Commons, and it specifically states, do not use this for source code. It's not legally enforceable for source code in many countries. And they say, for your project, you open source your code with like Apache, MIT, and use Creative Commons for everything else. So your artwork, your documentation is where the Creative Commons kicks in.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, I think your software is great. I've made grading phones and stuff a lot more user-friendly for us non-developer type. But my question is, once it becomes a standard, as it is, then doesn't that take a lot of time? And since you're not charging for it, how does that work?
Well, the question was, how do you, when it blows up and gets big, how much time do you spend on that, and how do you balance that? Is that basically along the lines of, and how do you maintain that going forward, right?
Right. There's got to be time and energy put into it, right?
There is certainly a lot of time and energy that we put into it. When we started, we knew that was going to be true, that we were going to have to put a lot of effort into it. Part of what helps is the community that's spraying up around us. I've got some people in our IRC channel, and any given day I can log in and see somebody that's asked a question, and there's a pretty large number of people that actually hang out in there and will answer people's questions to the best of their ability. And so that helps a lot with keeping us out of that support cycle, if you will. That's where that GitHub issues log, where we try to steer people to report bugs, kind of comes in. Usually people will ask a question, they'll have a problem, and if it actually does turn out to be a bug, it'll eventually bubble its way over there so that we'll know that, hey, we need to take a look at this. The documentation that I talked about before helps a lot with that too. We've got this compile guide so that another developer, especially a lot of your device maintainers, can say, hey, I got this brand new $600 device that I can't afford to buy because I can't afford to buy 20, 30 devices a year. So they'll take that compile guide, they'll take our source code. That's part of the reason why we chose to be open source, was so that those other developers could come along and download our source code and then compile it for their device. And so that keeps us out of that device configuration, device maintenance side of things in a huge way. And some of them will come to us and give us their device configuration files so that we can add them to our official support, if you will. But that helps us a lot there too, by getting those developers engaged and involved in the project. Even though they're not necessarily contributing source code, they're contributing by maintaining a device for us. there's probably at least as many, if not 2 or 3 times as many unofficially supported devices where developers come along and just compiled it for their device, but they didn't necessarily work with us to make it official, and that's totally fine with us. We just want our project to be out there as much as we can, so. Any other questions? Okay, well, I'll be available to answer any other questions that people might have, especially if you didn't want to ask them in front of the whole group afterwards. Again, thank you very much for coming.